to join us. Now, I don't know about you, but when I watch these mainstream media, there's often discussion about Islam, and there's discussion about Christianity, but it's rarely about the heart of the matter. It's about peripheral issues. It's about more contemporary issues. It's not about the issues at the heart of these two faiths. And I'm really glad tonight that that's what we are going to be talking about. We're going to be talking about things at the heart of Christianity and at the heart of Islam. So I think that's the question, who is Jesus, takes us there. Now, tonight's debate's between two views. It's between the view of Jesus presented in the New Testament and the view of Jesus that's presented in the Quran. Now, this evening, I'll be presenting to you a case why the New Testament is the best source of evidence about Jesus, and I'll explain what the New Testament has to say about him. As a Muslim, Zakir believes that the Quran is the best source of information about Jesus, and he believes what it says about him, because Muslims believe that Allah dictated every word of the Quran directly to Muhammad. So why do I turn to the New Testament to find out about Jesus? The reason is that it's a good historical source. No other historical source comes close to it in terms of reliability and credibility. The New Testament documents were written early. They were written very soon after Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. The books in the New Testament were put into their final written forms in between the late 40s AD and at the latest, the 90s AD. So the first ones were written within 20 years of Jesus' death and resurrection. Now, it wasn't just a case that 20 years later, some of Jesus' followers sat down to see what they could remember about what happened 20 years ago. Right from the time of Jesus' life, throughout until the Gospels were written, the stories circulated among their followers. They gained new followers. They wanted to tell them about Jesus. So the stories circulated among Jesus' followers. That was the way information was dealt with mainly in those days. It was an oral society, and things could be transmitted very reliably in that way. When the Gospels were finally committed to written form, that was still among Jesus' circle of family, friends, and followers. And they formalized this oral tradition into written documents. The Gospels we have in the New Testament, they're all either written by eyewitnesses or based closely on eyewitness testimony. And they were written at a time while the eyewitnesses were still alive to review what was being written down. So these first followers of Jesus, wanting to preserve their experience of Jesus, wanted to record a record of his deeds and actions and his words. What did they report? What do they have to say about Jesus? Well, I'm going to start off with a reading from Mark's Gospel. This is when Jesus is on trial. The high priest asked him, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?" "I am," said Jesus. "And you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." The high priest tore his clothes. "Why do we need any more witnesses?" he asked. "You've heard the blasphemy. What do you think?" They all condemned him as worthy of death. Now, that story was from Mark's Gospel, which many people believe was the first Gospel to be written. Now, there's two things I'd like to pick up on from that passage. First of all, Jesus described himself as the Son of God, the Son of God. Also, in Mark's Gospel, God describes Jesus as the Son of God at his baptism and at the Transfiguration. And the corollary of that is Jesus describes his Father in heaven, calls him Abba, an intimate term for fatherhood. And again, that was unprecedented in Judaism of the time. So this was a unique relationship that Jesus was conveying, son and fathership with God. The second phrase from the passage I read was that Jesus described himself as the Son of Man. Now, that might sound quite an innocuous phrase. It might just sound like a term for a human. And it can be that. But the Son of Man was understood in a very particular way to the Jews of the time. And it was understood as a reference to a vision recorded in the Old Testament in Daniel chapter 7. And this is what it says. It says, "In my vision at night I looked, and there was before me one like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All nations and peoples of every language worshipped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed." So this Son of Man was worshipped. Now, if the Jews were clear about anything, they were clear that you only worship God. but the Son of Man was worshipped. The phrases used to describe the Son of Man, all nations and peoples, every language worshipped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, etc. Those phrases are also used in the same vision in Daniel to describe, they're applied to God as well. So it's taking phrases applied to God and applying them to the Son of Man. And that phrase, there's still the Ancient of Days, but there's a separate figure called the Son of Man. And they both have the descriptions that fit God applied to them. So this God-man figure, the Son of Man, who shares in God's identity, is what Jesus was referring to when he again and again and again referred to himself as the Son of Man. No wonder he was accused of blasphemy when he made those statements. Well, the third thing to look at from the New Testament is when prophets spoke in Judaism of the time, they would say, "Thus saith the Lord," and they would read from the Old Testament, conveying God's message to the people. But when Jesus spoke, he said something different. He would start with things written in the Old Testament, and then not say, "This is what God says." He would then say, "But I say." And he would often prefix his statements with the word "Amen," which is translated often as "Verily, verily," or "Truly I say to you." Now that phrase was normally used as a prefix to stating what God had said. And that's why people responded to Jesus with statements like this. What is this? A new teaching with authority. Jesus spoke in a way that implied that his words were God's words. Number 4, the New Testament record Jesus' miracles, and sources outside the New Testament report Jesus' reputation as a miracle worker. And these miracles were worked through the power of the God that Jesus called Father. Right, number 5. In the New Testament, we hear that Jesus declared sins forgiven. But in Judaism, only God could declare sins forgiven. That was a divine prerogative. So if we read from Mark chapter 2, again, note from Mark's Gospel I'm reading from. When Jesus saw their faith, he said to the paralyzed man, "Son, your sins are forgiven." Now some teachers of the law were sitting there, thinking to themselves, "Why does this fellow talk like that? He's blaspheming. Who can forgive sins but God alone?" Number 6, of course, the New Testament records Jesus' death and resurrection. And Jesus' resurrection was the ultimate affirmation by God on his life and teaching. After Jesus' resurrection, he was even more explicit about his divinity, and that became clearer to his followers. In Matthew 28, Jesus said this, "All authority on heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit." All authority in heaven and earth, that belongs to God. That can only belong to God. So Jesus is associating himself with that authority that is God's alone. At the end, it's not baptizing them in the name of God. It's baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And the first Christians at the time worshipped Jesus, and they accepted that worship. Now, I could go on with other themes from the New Testament that point in the same direction. But to conclude, Jesus and God in the New Testament are shown to be somehow one. Jesus is divine. God's not a simple unity, but includes the Father in heaven and Jesus the Son. Jesus was God in human form. Now, some people suggest that this idea developed over decades, over centuries in the early church. If you look at the writings in the New Testament, that's not the case, because the New Testament writings came thick and fast. But every single book in the New Testament gives the same picture of Jesus as being divine. There was no controversy over this issue among the early Christians that we have any record of. It was the belief that was accepted from the very beginning of the church. Now, in the New Testament, the earliest writings in the New Testament, many think, were actually by the Apostle Paul. So I'm just going to have a look at some of the things that he had to say about Jesus as well, as samples of what the very first Christians believed. Now, Paul took passages from the Old Testament that referred to Yahweh, to the God of Israel, and he used them, and instead of Yahweh, he put in Lord for Lord Jesus Christ. So he put Jesus in the place of God in Old Testament teaching. The word he used when he said Jesus as Lord was kurios, the Greek word that was used in the New Testament of the Old Testament of the time as a substitute for divine name Yahweh. So when Paul said that Jesus was given the name above every name, that means that Jesus shared in the name of Yahweh, the name of God. Also in Paul's writings, we see that the early Christians prayed to Jesus. At the end of 1 Corinthians 15, there's a famous little line that includes the word Maranatha, which means come Lord. It was a prayer to Jesus. It's an Aramaic word. The reason Paul didn't translate it into Greek along with the rest of the letter was because people must have been familiar with it. It must have been a common prayer in the early church, and Paul's quoting it in the form that was already familiar to people. Also in the New Testament, particularly in Paul's letters, we find extracts that are thought to be early Christian hymns that were well known to the early Christians, so Paul can quote them and appeal to something that they're already aware of. And those hymns are about Jesus, but they're also sung to Jesus as an act of worship. Some writers outside of Christianity as well referred to that. They said these Christians sing hymns in worship to Christ. Now, these first Christians, they were still monotheists. They utterly rejected the idea of worshipping idols. They would be horrified at the idea of worshipping another god. But Jesus was given the sort of devotion that was reserved for God among devout Jews. They maintained their monotheism, not by adding Jesus to Yahweh, but by including Jesus in this divine uniqueness. So overall, from the New Testament, who was Jesus? The unique Son of God, who shared in God's identity, God in human form. That was believed by the first followers, and they were willing to die for those beliefs in the decades to come. Now notice what I've said there. It didn't depend on me assuming that the Gospels are inspired by God or have any special spiritual status. I believe they are. Could have argued that case. But for tonight, I'm happy to approach them just as historical documents written at the time that are a reliable account of Jesus' life and work and words. Right, I now move on to the Quran, or alternative source of information about Jesus. The Quran was written 600 years later by an Arab named Muhammad, who claimed to be receiving revelations from God. And according to Muslims, these revelations to Muhammad are what we now have written down in the Quran. Now, the Quran has no historical credibility with regard to Jesus' life on earth, having been written so late and such an isolated location. So a fundamental question for tonight's debate is this: which source do you trust? Here are the two choices. A, accounts from within the circle of eyewitnesses, friends and family of Jesus that were formalized within 20 to 40 years of Jesus' death. Or B, writings made hundreds of miles away in Arabia 600 years later among people who couldn't even have read the original reports. My answer to that question is A. Zakiya must answer that question B. When the Quran was written, there was no translation of the Gospels into Arabic, so Muhammad got what knowledge he had of Jesus from the few local Christians that he met. And they were far from the centers of the Christian faith. And their understanding of Christianity was often quite patchy and some inconsistencies in it. In his early ministry, Muhammad hoped that Jews and Christians would endorse his prophethood, but they didn't. And as Muhammad's prophecies went on, they became more and more critical of Jews and Christians, and he began to rewrite biblical stories differently, changing them, partly through his patchy knowledge of the biblical accounts, and partly to fit in with his own developing Islamic theology. If Muhammad wanted to present himself as God's most significant prophet, then Jesus needed downgrading. But I'd like to have a look a little bit about the Quran's track record of dealing with biblical stories. And I'll start with just a couple of illustrations from the Old Testament. Right, the first one, when the law was given to Moses on Mount Sinai, the Quran reports that God lifted Mount Sinai, held it above the heads of the Israelites, and then put it back in its place. Now, the accounts we have in the Bible in Exodus, obviously that's not recorded. That doesn't sound to me like the sort of thing people might have omitted from their account. That sounds quite a dramatic incident. So how on earth has that got into the Quran? How did that story end up in the Quran? Well, we know where that story came from. That story was made up as part of Jewish folklore in the intervening centuries. So that was a pre-existing story that someone had made up, was written down, and it's now in the Quran. Why is that in the Quran? Okay, number two, the Quran rewrites the story of Abraham. There's quite a bit to that. I'll just give you a few aspects of it. The Quran says that Abraham and Ishmael rebuilt the Kaaba. Now, the Kaaba is the black cube at the center of Islamic worship in Mecca. There's no record of that anywhere outside the Quran, no historical record of that, but then Muhammad said that that had happened. Muhammad changed the Quran changes the story about Abraham being instructed by God to sacrifice Isaac. The Quran changes it and says that Abraham was actually instructed to sacrifice Ishmael. Now, you may know many Muslims believe that Ishmael was the father of the Arabic race. Muhammad changed the story to reflect that. Now, looking at those stories, there was no previous record of them. You can either believe that God revealed those things to Muhammad in the 7th century, or you could believe that they seem to have been created with a purpose of backing up Islamic theology and supporting the views that Muhammad was trying to promote. Let's move on to the New Testament. Now, when Mary, the mother of Jesus, is introduced in the Quran, she's described as the sister of Aaron. Now, the sister of Aaron was called Miriam, and obviously lived 1,400 years earlier, which just seems a clear mistake. Now, Muhammad didn't have access to written records of the Bible. He just picked up things from local Christians. It's quite understandable that he might have got mixed up like that. I'm quite willing to accept that. In the Quran, we also find this story. The baby Jesus speaks from the cradle as a baby and says this, according to the Quran. I am indeed a servant of Allah. He's given me the book and appointed me a prophet. He's made me blessed wherever I may be and has enjoined upon me prayer and almsgiving. Right, the idea of Jesus speaking from the cradle, that's not in any of the Gospels. That's not mentioned in any of the accounts from the time. Where does that come from? How did that get into the Quran? Well, there was a document called the Arab Infancy Gospel, written in the 5th or 6th century, and so written before, well before the time of Muhammad, in Arabic, and that included a story of Jesus speaking from the cradle. So it's quite plausible that Muhammad could have come across that story, and then we find it in the Quran. The story is slightly changed in the Quran. The original story, Jesus didn't say, I'm a servant of Allah. Jesus said, I am Jesus, the Son of God, the Logos, who you have brought forth, as the angel Gabriel announced to you. And my Father has sent me for the salvation of the world. But perhaps that didn't fit with Muhammad's purposes. Now, if you look at what Jesus is proposed to have said in the Quran, it's clearly a reflection of Islamic theology. And the prayer and almsgiving, the words used, that's reflecting what are known today as two of the pillars of Islam. It also said that Jesus was given a book. Now, the Quran constantly misunderstands Jesus' purpose, as though his mission was to come and bring a book, and that book is called the Gospel. But obviously that wasn't what Jesus' mission was at all. Jesus didn't write a book, but Muhammad projects his own understanding of prophethood onto Jesus. That's another one from the Quran. It says the child Jesus making clay birds that then come to life and fly off. Wherever did that story come from? No records of that in the New Testament or in the early centuries. Well, it comes from the infancy gospel of Thomas. Many scholars think the infancy gospel of Thomas was written many centuries after Jesus and was basically a children's storybook, as we might have a children's Bible now with some embellishments. It's a document that has no credibility whatsoever. How does that story end up in the Quran? In the Quran, it claims that Jesus' disciples called themselves Muslims. The Quran claims that Jesus prophesied the coming of Muhammad. The Quran claims that Jesus wasn't crucified or killed by the Jews. Now, on the other hand, the Quran agrees with the New Testament on many points. So I'd assume that Zacchaeus believes that Jesus came through a virgin birth.
If I can ask you to conclude, please.
Yes, okay. Right, just to finish up, the Quran contradicts the New Testament, left, right, and center. But a big problem the Quran has is it says, if you want to check the veracity of the Quran, check it by checking it against the New Testament. Let the people of the gospel judge by that which Allah has revealed therein. So on the one hand, it's contradicting the New Testament. On the other hand, it's saying go to the New Testament to confirm the Quran. And how are Muslims going to reconcile that contradiction? The way they reconcile it in general is to try and undermine the reliability of the New Testament to the point where they can pick out the bits that agree with what's in the Quran, undermine the bits that don't agree with the Quran. Whereas what's really happening is they're taking what's in the Quran, taking that to be the absolute truth, and then interpreting the Bible in the light of that, discarding bits that don't fit, keeping bits that do fit. Now, I think the only way Zakir can really win the debate tonight is if he can persuade us that the Quran is indeed a revelation from God. And if he can persuade us of that, then that overrules all of these objections. So I'm looking forward to hearing Zakir's case that the Quran is indeed